Before I get going, so first, thanks very much to Matthias for making this happen, and it's great to have a full room. So you never know, with a subject that is topical but a presentation that is a bit technical, whether or not you're going to get the full house. But this is really fantastic, so I really appreciate that everyone's here. You'll notice there's a big star right here that's highlighting two things. First, this is work in progress. So this is partly work that was commissioned from me by a client who would prefer to remain nameless. So I will keep them in the dark for the moment, but it will be released as a working paper before the end of the year, hopefully. And the second thing in light of that is that the opinions are strictly mine. So please don't impute any of this to ADBI, ADB, World Bank, any other organisation that I'm sometimes affiliated with. So all of this is just me speaking. So basically what I'm going to do to step you through the presentation, I know this is kind of getting close to lunchtime, so people may be a bit in and out. The first slide, I'm just going to give you the key results. So I can just give you a really quick summary of what it is that I find in the analysis, and then I'll sort of step you through it. The motivation, I probably don't need to harp on. I honestly wasn't sure how much people in Japan are sort of talking about this, given that you've also got TPP to be talking about. So I wasn't sure how much this would register on the trade policy radar, but it obviously does. But I'll walk through some reasons why we would care about it, and focusing sort of not just on the case of Japan, but given that this is ADBI, on the case of developing Asia, so East, Southeast and South Asia. I'll talk to you briefly about the methodology and data, so that if you're not a technical person, just sort of ignore that part and just hear that it's a model. If you're a technical person, we can get into the details about how the model works and why it gives the particular results that it does. And then I'll do the two parts of the analysis. So one of the innovations of what I'm doing, I'm using a really garden variety model to answer this question in the first part, so when I use traditional trade data. But then to get a bit more interesting, I'm going to use trade in value added data as well from OECD and WTO. And the reason for that is that when I was thinking about this problem, I thought, not only does withdrawal from the EU and NAFTA reorient trade flows all over the world, it potentially does something to break up supply chains. And I think it's actually this second part that is more important, and it's probably this second part that's really going to catch on in Asia, where people care a lot about supply chains and value chains. So I've tried to give some quantitative evidence on that in that section. And then I'll just sort of conclude with policy implications in the last part. I should say, as far as questions go, we've got Q&A time primarily at the end. But if you've got what we call in the States a double-hander, so something that really can't wait, a clarification, something I've said that is incredibly ambiguous and needs to be cleared up instantaneously, please don't hesitate to intervene. I'm quite happy to do that on the fly. So with that, let's get into it. So basically 5 points that I'd like you to walk away with from the presentation. And these are sort of qualitative interpretations from the modelling that I'm going to be doing. So the first one is that even though we're sitting here in Asia, we're a long way away from Brexit, we feel like we're a bit closer to NAFTA because, if you believe in APEC and all this sort of stuff, then the US and Canada and Mexico are all kind of part of it, all part of the Pacific Rim. But Brexit and NAFTA are essentially a long way away from what we're doing here. There's a lot of regional initiatives going on in Asia with greater or lesser degrees of success. Having said all that, the trade network is a closed network. It's a closed, complex network. And that means that when you change one bit of it, you change every bit of it. Okay, so a big part of what I'm going to show you is the way that these effects ripple through even to quite distant countries. And I'll show you an example. In fact, one of the countries that stands out as having a large relative gain from Brexit, and gain again is surprising, right? We think this is all losses, but actually there are some gains in there as well, is Cambodia. Okay, so a small country in Southeast Asia trying to industrialise, doing good stuff in textiles and garments and some other sectors. They actually stand to do pretty well out of this. And we'll have to talk about some of the reasons why that might be. So that's point one. Point two is exactly this point about benefits. Okay, so if I was giving this talk to an audience in the UK or the US, I would be talking about what an unmitigated disaster it is to pull out of an agreement like the EU or NAFTA. Okay? I would be making that point very strongly, and indeed many have made that point very strongly in those two countries. When I come here, it's actually a bit different, because part of what happens when a country pulls out of a trade agreement is that its demand gets reoriented from its regional partners to other countries. Okay, that demand has got to go somewhere. The politicians want it to go internally, and that's part of what happens. But the other part of what happens is that it goes throughout the rest of the trading network. And so there are actually opportunities for developing Asia through that mechanism. We'll see that, as I mentioned, Cambodia, another country that stands out is Bangladesh, as having significant export opportunities from this based on their pre-existing relationships. Having said that, it's not all good news. Point 3, some countries lose. Okay, so there's a reorientation of trade costs on a multilateral level. It's a complex effect, it ripples, it depends on what pre-existing trade flows look like, it depends on what pre-existing multilateral trade barriers look like, but when it all comes out in the wash, we find this mix of benefits and losses. And in fact, the distribution is relatively different across Brexit and NAFTA, depending on what we're looking at. Okay, then the fourth point, and this is the one that I think will really bite in the present room. I find some evidence that changes like Brexit and the EU leaving NAFTA have different effects on intermediate goods trade and final goods trade. Okay, now this is the bit that I'm still working on. Okay, so what you're going to see is really kind of hot off the press. But what that means is that when we do all the math all the way through, we find that Brexit tends to produce a bit of a disintegration in Asian supply chains. Okay, it's not a huge sort of seismic effect, but it's an effect that is definitely there. We see that some of the integration of global value chains that has taken place within Asia and between Asia and Europe dies as a result of Brexit. Okay, so the level of integration decreases. With NAFTA, we find actually the opposite effect. The reason being that a lot of the supply chain activity in NAFTA has been focused on intermediates coming from Mexico to the US and Canada. When you kick Mexico out, which is the objective of the whole thing, you end up with a different distribution of intermediate goods trade. Okay, so again, this issue of sort of costs and opportunities comes out in the value-added data as well. And then in policy terms, point number 5, what does all of this mean for policymakers in Asia? I mean, if you're a trade policymaker in Asia, you've got a lot to do at the moment. Is there going to be TPP 11? What's going on with RCEP, if anything? What about the free trade area of the Asia Pacific? There are all these sort of things going on. Plus, many Asian countries are negotiating their own agreements with other partners, including the European Union and including various other partners around the world. My point is that on that very crowded agenda, we've also got to add, what do we do about trade policy changes going on a long way away from us? Okay, my whole point through these 5 points is that we can't just sit here, geographically distant and say it doesn't matter. Okay, it clearly does matter for us. And of course, to get policymakers' attention, what's the thing that we always say? It matters for jobs. Okay, so all of this, I'm not doing for my health. Talking about the reorientation of trade flows, disintegration of supply chains, all of this matters for jobs. Okay, jobs in our countries, jobs in the countries making the changes. So there is a really good, strong rationale for policymakers to be involved. Okay, so if you've got to leave early, that's the talk. Okay, that's basically where I'm getting to, with a whole bunch of technical detail in the middle. Okay, now let me step back and go through all of that much more slowly and in more detail. So I want to start with a bit of motivation. So what motivated me to start thinking about this and working on it, other than the fact that I had a client who was very concerned about it, which obviously is a big motivation in and of itself. But I think there are some interesting things going on. One thing I note is that trade is very broadly supported in Asia and particularly in developing Asia. The statistics here that I'm showing are a bit old. They're from the end of 2014. It's a Pew Research Centre. I'm sure you guys know them. They do polls periodically asking people what they think about increased trade and business integration with other countries. And if you look across the Asian countries, attitudes about trade basically vary between enthusiastic and over the moon. Okay, so if you look at a country like Vietnam, it's close to 100% of respondents saying we are happy that our government is engaging more with businesses overseas and doing more trade. Okay, Japan is smaller. The United States is smaller. But even a country like India, which historically has been very sceptical of trade for all sorts of reasons, when you actually go and ask, the guy in the street, the ordinary guy, what he thinks about trade, this is what you get, okay, that people broadly support it. Now, having said that, it doesn't feel like that right now, does it? If you guys have been watching the press in the United States and the United Kingdom, you would think that trade doesn't have a single friend anywhere. Indeed, in our last presidential campaign, I would argue the two parties were engaging in a bit of a contest to see who could be more anti-trade. And that's something that we haven't historically seen, or at least we've seen people campaign like that but then govern quite differently. And I think in this case, what was campaigned on is much closer to what's being governed on, however that may be. So where is that coming from? Firstly, I would put this, in relative terms. If I were to extend this graph out and give you data for the whole world, you'd find that I'm very much talking about the UK, France, the United States, and a few other rich developed markets. You go and ask Sweden and Norway and Finland what they think about trade, they're much more in this category, okay, very enthusiastic. So it's not the whole of the European Union, it's not even the whole of North America, it's these selected instances where people have grown to a bit suspect of trade. And why is that? I think it ties into a number of things that we observe empirically. One is that real incomes in the United States have been relatively flat. Depending how you measure it, they've been flat for the last few decades. Maybe they're picking up over the last few years. Maybe it's all going on healthcare. There's sort of multiple interpretations of what's going on. But the bottom line is that if you talk to the average guy on the street and you ask him, do you feel better off now than you were 20 years ago, he's going to say no, I feel exactly the same. But on the other hand, the guys earning $1 million a year, I feel like they're much better off than they were 20 years ago. So this issue over flat real incomes and inequality is a genuine issue. Second point is the China shock. I'm sure everyone's read, there's a famous paper by David Autor, Gordon Hanson, Darren Acemoglu and a couple other guys quantifying the effect of trade openness with China and the United States. And it was extremely negative on a local basis. Okay, so of course as economists, we need to distinguish the local from the global. And maybe the lesson that we get from this is that we've spent too much time talking about the global. So saying that opening to China is a good thing for the United States economy as a whole, and forgetting that it's a very bad thing for Flint, Michigan. Okay, so Flint, Michigan is an old manufacturing town in the United States, and similarly pocketed all through Ohio and Pennsylvania and these, actually a number of the states that flipped in the last election, you see this sort of thing going on. Then of course the third thing we've got to deal with is that a lot of this is just simple xenophobia. So people not feeling great about foreigners, and that extending to things that foreigners make. Okay, so we don't want to import things because they're made by other people. We want them all made at home. Okay, whatever that means in a supply chain context. So I think all of those things are going on. Then I think the other characteristic we've got to take into account is the level of uncertainty in the trade landscape. And I think that is genuinely new. I mean, this stuff here, we've been dealing with for some time. Okay, the China shock peaked in 2006. It's now 2017. Okay, so 11 years onwards. Flat incomes have arguably been flat since the 1970s. Okay, so why is it such an issue now? But anyway, what's different is that through that whole period, I think we could be pretty confident that the GATT WTO system was holding together. Okay, that it was capping what people could do in terms of their protectionist behaviour. It was progressively liberalising, and people were respecting the outcome of dispute settlement, all this sort of thing. I think we now have real reason to doubt that. Okay, so we're receiving messages from major players that maybe the rules are not exactly sort of rules. Okay, so that's a really big issue. So the trade policy agenda has definitely become more uncertain. So Asia, I think, is quite different from this. As I said in the graph, a lot of people in Asia are really quite ecstatic about trade, less so in Japan than in developing Asia, but people really tend to feel pretty good about it when you go and ask them. Having said that, Asia is often on the wrong end of the change of opinion in the large developed markets. So particularly in the United States, a lot of the anti-trade animus to some extent is not really about trade as such, it's about trade with China very specifically. Okay, so if we think of Mr. Navarro, the White House trade, I'm not sure what he is, I can't call him a guru because he's not, but anyway, the White House trade guy, his thing is China. Okay, the trade with China has been ruinous for the US. It's a very sort of simple, simplistic kind of argument. But having said that, you know, as I said, the trade network is a closed, complex network. So when we change one bit of it, we change every bit of it. Okay, the reason intuitively is that trade responds to relative prices. Okay, so we've got good theoretical reasons for believing this. We've got good models that suggest that. But this is the sort of one thing to keep in mind all through the presentation. Trade depends on relative prices. And if that's true, as soon as you change one price, you change everything else, every other ratio that depends on it. Okay? So that means that this question is interesting. Okay? What does the US exit from NAFTA, if that happens, and the UK's exit from the EU, which will happen, have to do with Asia? Okay, so what are the implications for Asian countries and specifically for Asian developing countries? Just to give you a bit of a feel for where that impact might come from, I've just quickly sort of divided up the Asian export pie into its component parts. I'm distinguishing between East Asia and Pacific and South Asia. So sorry to the ADB guys, I've used World Bank country classifications, which I know you really hate, but it's easier in Stata because they produce all the data. But anyway, so you can see basically that the EU and NAFTA between them actually take quite a lot of Asian countries' exports. So if we're talking about East Asia, it's sort of 14 plus 19, so 33%, and getting up closer to sort of 50%, just under 50% for South Asia. So my trier when I see that is that the effects are probably going to be bigger generally in South Asia than they are in East Asia and the Pacific, just because we've got a higher degree of baseline integration. But we'll see that as we go through the model. Second thing that we need to think about, because I'm going to be talking about value chains in the last part of the presentation, I pulled some data out of the OECD WTO TIVA database, and this is showing you the share of intermediates in total export. I'm not going to go through the magic by which these figures are produced. If anyone's interested, it's all described on the TIVA website. But basically what you can see is that the shares of intermediates are pretty high in Asia. So we know that, right? I mean, we know that the development strategy in East and Southeast Asia has been outward-looking, export-oriented, and heavily directed towards the development of supply chains with these large networks of suppliers, supplying component parts, sending them to a production facility for final assembly, and then shipping the good off. Okay, so that is completely consistent with the sort of development model that we're used to talking about in East and Southeast Asia. Less so in South Asia, and you can see that in India, for example, the ratio is a bit lower. But I would say even in India, intermediates trade is substantial. Okay, so we have a substantial basis for believing that a trade shock somewhere in the system could impact this kind of chart as well. Okay, I'll skip that. Okay, let me get into the method and data, and this is the part. If you're not a technical person, please feel free to sort of think about something else for the next slide, something nice, you know, a Swiss meadow with you know, animals in it and a cheese factory down the road, that sort of thing. So whatever brings you to a peaceful sort of place, because there are a couple of equations. Basically what I wanted to highlight, there's nothing new in what I'm about to say. This is well known, but it's often forgotten when people do empirical work. And the first point is that if you use a traditional gravity model, like that one that I've stuck up the top, your answer to the question, what does NAFTA and Brexit have to do with Asia, is absolutely nothing. Okay, because in the traditional gravity model, bilateral trade only depends on bilateral trade costs. Okay, so I mean plus GDP and all that other stuff. But if you have a trade change between the UK and France, that has no impact on trade between Japan and China, or even between Japan and the UK. Okay, so that's the traditional model. It's completely counterintuitive. Okay, we have no reason for believing that. But literally thousands of those kinds of models have been used by researchers, governments, all sorts of people. Okay, so we need to do a bit better, and to do a bit better we only have to go back sort of 10, 15 years in the literature to get the gravity with gravitas model that I'm sure people are very familiar with. It's a micro-founded model, so starting off with an understanding of rationalising behaviour and then building the model up from a representative consumer and a representative producer. And basically what you find is that bilateral trade depends definitely on bilateral trade costs, but also on a CES aggregate of prices across all routes. Okay, CES is just due to the form of the demand function. That can change if you use a different demand function. But the key point is what they call multilateral resistance. And what they termed out in the paper is the relative prices matter terms. Okay, so multilateral resistance is this way of capturing the fact that we are in a closed, integrated network. So change one bit of it, change the whole thing. Okay? And thankfully, the way that they do it is pretty simple. So the gravity model that I'm going to be working with is this one here. Anyone who's done work with gravity recently will be very familiar with that. If I just walk you through it, you have the standard gravity idea that trade is directly proportional on exported GDP and imported GDP, so that's all there. It's inversely proportional to trade costs because 1 minus sigma is a negative number. And the innovation is that you get this pi I and pj. Okay, so pi I is outward multilateral resistance. That's saying that for me to export my stuff to another country, it depends not only on bilateral trade costs on that route, but also on trade costs across all other potential destination markets. Okay? Then we have PJ, which is the mirror of that. When I import from somewhere, I don't just care about trade costs on the import route. I care about those relative to trade costs across all possible import routes. Okay? So you can immediately see that with this model, and I haven't put the partials up here, but you can immediately see that with this model, if I take the derivative with respect to tik, I don't get 0. And if I take the derivative with respect to tkl, I don't get 0, okay, because of the existence of these two terms. Okay, so this is exactly the model we want. It's saying that something like Brexit and NAFTA can have an impact even on very distant countries. Now, there's a bit of a trick that I have to use for this. So normally when you estimate this model, you use fixed effects. The reason being that the multilateral price indices are unobservable. Okay, so they don't correspond to any price index that is kept by any statistical agency anywhere on Earth. You can't use the CPI, you can't use the PPI. It's got to be a specific index for this very purpose. So you can get rid of these things easily with fixed effects. But the problem is that if you do that and then run a counterfactual simulation, you're back to the basic model because the fixed effects don't change in the counterfactual, and so you don't get this complex reallocation due to general equilibrium effects. Okay, so we've got to use a bit of a trick to get that, and the trick is a Taylor series expansion of the multilateral resistance terms from Bayer and Bergstrand. They have a nice article in the JIE from 2008-2009. And basically all you do, you've got to go through a lot of math to get to this point, but the adjustments are actually really simple. So really you're just taking global averages across exporters, importers, and then all countries, and using that to adjust your trade policy terms. Okay, so you end up with these, TIJ star terms, where you've got your initial trade costs and then adjusted by these three terms that are essentially sort of GDP weighted averages of trade costs across all routes. Okay, so they look like the old indices that people used to use to try and capture remoteness, but they're actually much more sophisticated because they come directly from the theory. Okay, so just one footnote. Bayer and Bergstrand estimate by OLS. I don't think that's such a great idea, so I use PPML. If people have been in the literature, You know there's a good reason for that. It's better for dealing with heteroscedasticity. You get unbiased estimates, etc., in the presence of zero and heteroscedasticity. So I just estimate that way. But this is very much the approach that I use. So it's very simple to implement. You just adjust each of the trade cost variables and you can apply it straight away. In terms of data, I use two data sources. For the traditional trade data, I use a data set called BARCHI, which is from the CEPI Research Centre in France. This is UN Comtrade data, but the guys in Paris have played with it so that it's balanced. Okay, reported exports equal reported imports. Okay, whereas we know in Comtrade data they don't. Okay, firstly because you've got a SIF-FOB margin and then you've got differences in reporting practices. So these guys have gone through and in a very sophisticated way tried to reconcile all the flows and rebalance the matrix. Then for observable trade costs, I use a bunch of standard gravity variables, so that's in any gravity model you'll ever see. I use a dummy for RTA membership. Then I use separate dummies for EU membership and NAFTA membership. The reason for that being that I'm suspicious that the EU and NAFTA may have effects that are stronger than the average RTA. Okay, so I want to see if the data bear that out. And well, then to get some other sort of dimensions of what's going on, particularly really just with Brexit, I code some variables for GSP treatment, so it's the generalised system of preferences, and then an interaction between GSP treatment and an LDC dummy for the exporter. So that's the captured duty-free, quota-free treatment. Now the reason why I do that is that one huge uncertainty we have under Brexit is what happens to the EU's system of preferences. Okay, we don't know if Great Britain is going to adopt that, whether they're going to have their own system. All they've announced so far is that they will maintain duty-free, quota-free treatment for LDCs, but we don't know what they're doing for everyone else. Okay, so I want to try and get that into the equation somehow. Okay, and so when I do it, this is what comes out of the first model. So this is the standard trade data model. You can see this looks very much like a kind of, a garden variety gravity model. The distance coefficient is a bit lower than usual. That's typical with PPML, so not too concerned about that. The controls come out basically as we would expect. The common colonizer looks a bit weird, but it's not statistically significant, so we don't mind about it so much. First two things that I'm interested in are the RTA dummy and EU and NAFTA. So the RTA dummy comes out strongly positive, so RTAs tend to promote trade between their members, as they should. EU does so much more than typical RTA. Again, exactly what we would expect, since it's a deep agreement. It covers services, investment, people movements, all these sorts of things. Bad news for NAFTA, though. It looks like it's just a garden variety RTA. It doesn't have any trade promoting effect beyond what we would see in a sort of standard average RTA. So I was surprised by that, given the amount of trade that's actually increased in North America post-NAFTA. But anyway, that's the way it turns out. Second surprise is that the GSP does absolutely nothing to promote exports. So that's a different paper. I'd maybe like to write that paper. There is some literature on the GSP, and in fact, when you look around at it, there's a surprising amount that says actually these schemes are completely ineffective. We can talk, if anyone's interested in that in Q&A, I've got some theories as to why they're sort of completely ineffective. But anyway, that's the result that we find. So summarising there, the model looks good, RTAs boost trade, NAFTA only has an average effect, but the EU has a much stronger one, and we find nothing from the GSP. So then we can run the two counterfactuals. Okay, one for NAFTA, one for Brexit. The NAFTA one is the easy one. All we're doing is setting RTA equal to 0 between the US and its NAFTA partners, Canada and Mexico. That's all we have to do. Then we just resolve the model and we get our counterfactual impacts. I'm assuming here, by the way, that Canada and Mexico like each other enough to stay in a NAFTA 2 if NAFTA 3 falls apart. Whether that's realistic or not, I don't really know, but that's my assumption. No other changes. Okay, so basically the only changes that we're looking at in NAFTA are these indirect ones that come from essentially the US reorienting its demand from its regional partners to other countries. Okay? The Brexit counterfactual is more complicated. First part's the same. We said RTA equals 0 and EU equals 0 between the UK and its EU partners. But then we've also got to do something about RTAs between the EU and all of its partner countries, okay? And that's relevant in developing Asia, particularly the Pacific, where they have economic partnership agreements. And so my assumption is that the UK is not going to have time to renegotiate all of those agreements before it initiates Brexit, okay? So they're going to exit the EU and those agreements will cease to exist for the United Kingdom, okay? You can take a different view on that assumption. If you do, you'll get different results, but that's the view that I've taken. So here, you get the same indirect effects as with NAFTA from the reorientation of demand, but you also get direct effects through the fact that the UK is not going to honour some EU trade agreements with Asian countries, okay? And I should say, just a footnote, I've excluded in the counterfactual the GSP, okay? So I could run a counterfactual with GSP, but because it didn't come out statistically significant, I don't think that's a particularly valid sort of exercise. So I've just done these elements. And when I do it, this is what I find. Okay, so this is just pulling out Asian countries considered broadly. The blue bars are Brexit, the red bars are NAFTA, and this is percentage changes in total exports. So this is not exports to the UK or to the US, this is total exports. So a couple of things to note. Firstly, and in a sense this is surprising, but the Brexit impacts are much larger in relative terms than NAFTA. Now the reason that's surprising is that, you know, NAFTA, that's kind of part of APEC, right? So if you believe that APEC has got something to do with Asian trade relations, having a major disruption in a huge part of APEC's GDP, you'd think would have big implications for developing countries in Asia. In fact, it doesn't. The effects are very, very small, you know, sort of a small fraction of a percent. And so I think that's an interesting point. It says a lot about what NAFTA did. So NAFTA, I think, primarily developed these North American supply chains and perhaps didn't have an awful lot to do with Asian trade, at least in goods. And services may be a different question, but in goods, that's what comes out. Now, the Brexit results are interesting. We find some large impacts. I mean, I would say anything over 1% of total exports for a trade policy change of a single country on the other side of the world is something we need to care about. Okay? Notice that there's a bunch of positives here. And this is the effect that I was mentioning before, whereby there's this reorientation of demand. So where the UK is currently buying things from Europe, once it pulls out of Europe, trade costs with Europe go up, which means trade costs with everyone else go down in relative terms. So if you're Cambodia right here, some of these other countries, I mean, that's French Polynesia, special case, Mongolia, New Zealand, China, you see your trade going up, okay, because you're swallowing up some of that extra demand that gets generated. And one thing I just note here, you know, the China bar isn't that tall. It's 0.5%. But that's 0.5% of China's total exports. So we're dealing with one of the largest traders in the world. So if I were to convert that to dollar terms, that's a big number. Okay, that's enough to care about. From a development point of view, we care about that. Also, now something I haven't modelled is what follows on from the increase in China's trade to the rest of Asia. Okay, because we know that Asian supply chains are quite integrated and often focused around China. So that's one part of the impact. Let's take a look at South Asia. As I said, I expected the impact in South Asia to be a bit bigger than in East Asia because Britain is comparatively a larger trading partner, and that's generally what we find. So whereas in the East Asian graph we had a couple of countries above 1%, here we have sort of most countries above 1% of total export. Again, if you're Bangladesh, you know, as a country of 80 million people, a 2.5% increase in your total exports is nothing to sneeze at. Okay, if you think of that in the context of current world trade growth, that's actually pretty significant from a trade change taking place on the other side of the world. India a bit less, but Sri Lanka also doing quite well. And again, it's this reorientation of demand. Okay, so the UK no longer dealing with its EU partners and looking elsewhere in the world to fill its demands. Okay, oh, and again, just to highlight the NAFTA impact's much smaller all the way across the board. Okay, I think I've generally talked about this. So the impacts I would classify as modest. Having said that, if I show you a graph, which I'm not going to do, but if I show you a graph of the bilateral impacts, okay, so that is to say exports from Bangladesh to the UK, those numbers are big. Okay, so those numbers often change by 10 or 20%. Okay, I tend to think that those numbers are a bit big, probably due to the simplicity of the model that I'm running, but it gives you an idea of the sorts of economic forces that are in play. So these big bilateral forces that translate into smaller total forces just because of the size of the trade markets that we're dealing with. Okay, let's have a peek at the more innovative part, which is the trade in value-added data. So what I've done here is run two models separately for final goods and intermediate goods. This is aggregating across all sectors. So this is total trade in final goods, total trade in intermediate goods. The models are pretty similar. So we find, again, RTA and EU having strong effects, NAFTA having no effect. I left out GSP because this is a much smaller sample, so there's very little GSP treatment in it. And what I've done to try and capture the impact on value chains is report percentage point changes in the share of intermediates in total exports. Okay? So we associate that number, so the share of intermediates with total exports, and increase tends to indicate greater value chain integration, and a decrease tends to indicate value chain disintegration. Okay, so let's see what we get when we do that. As you can see, we get quite a mixed bag, but the thing to note is all these negatives. Okay, and once we've noted all the negatives, we note that most of the negatives are in fact blue rather than red. So the effect of the UK's reorientation of demand following Brexit is actually negative for GVCs in Asia, as far as I can tell. Again, these are modest effects. So we're talking about less than a percentage point difference, typically. But that's a percentage point of total trade. So to change that over a period of time actually takes the building up of significant industrial capacity. So what we're looking at here, I would argue, is significant industrial disruption in some of these countries. Okay, so a decrease in relative demand for intermediate goods. So big implication for supply chains. Having said that, other countries do quite nicely, particularly out of NAFTA. Why is that? Okay, well, again, the point of the US renegotiating NAFTA is that they don't feel like importing intermediates from Mexico anymore. So if they're not importing them from Mexico anymore, they've got to import them from somewhere else. And part of that demand is going to go, of course, they want it all to go to the United States. That's not going to happen. It's going to go partly to the United States and partly to Asia. Okay, so we see an increase in the share of intermediates in a number of Asian countries, and also in Canada as a North American country. Okay, so that's the impact that we get on value chains. I'd say, you know, my take on the sort of trade numbers is that we get modest overall effects, but these value chain numbers really worry me. They look small, but the business model is so sensitive that I just wonder, you know, if I had guys from Japanese companies sitting in this room right now, would they be telling me, okay, that's enough for us to alter our business model? Because remember, these are business models that are dealing on tiny margins and tiny inventories. It's very, very precisely calibrated. So if that's the case, you know, is this at the tipping point where suddenly these things start disintegrating and we undo a lot of the good work that we've been doing? So that's an open question. We can talk about it in Q&A. Okay, so let me just sort of sum up where we've gotten to. First point, the trading system is a great example of a global, closed, integrated network, which means that if you change something somewhere, you change everything everywhere. Okay, so these distant trade policy changes are important for Asia, even though we are geographically distant from where they are going on. One, I think, slightly counterfactual result is that even though the UK is a considerably smaller market than the US, and also a more distant market than the US, the trade orientation brought about by Brexit is actually larger than what is brought about by the US exiting NAFTA. Okay, so I think that's potentially an interesting result. And you guys can tell me, but I would suggest that that's probably the opposite of what many policymakers in Asia are thinking. I would guess that they are more concerned about NAFTA than Brexit. But anyway, you guys can correct me on that in the Q&A. So positives and negatives. There is this reorientation. Some countries lose exports as a result of Brexit and the US pulling out of NAFTA. Others gain export through this dynamic of reorienting demand away from regional partners towards more distant trading partners. Is that good for the overall welfare of the world trading system? That's not my question. Okay, I'm just looking at the impact on trade flows, the impact on Asian countries. But those positives and negatives are definitely there. Stronger effects than South Asia than East Asia. Then one bullet I forgot, but I think is really crucial. We really need to pay attention to these value chain results. So one thing I'd love to do is to talk to some guys who are actually building value chains. So, Japan is a great place to do that. They've been very active building value chains in East and Southeast Asia. And seeing that reorientation of what intermediate versus final goods trade looks like, is that enough to fundamentally change the business model, to undermine it in some significant way? I don't know the answer to that, but I would very much like to talk to people who have more insight on it. Then one thing that we particularly need to look at, and I think this is an issue for ADB, some countries don't just have the indirect effects that I've mostly been talking about here, this kind of network effect and reorientation of demand. They also have a very direct impact. So the Pacific Islands have signed an interim economic partnership agreement with the European Union. If the UK exits the European Union and doesn't sign a new EPA or continue the terms of the existing EPA with the Pacific Island countries, then they lose their preferential market access to the UK, and that's a really big deal for those countries. Okay, so Asia and the Pacific, we talk a lot more about Asia than we do about the Pacific. But this is one case where it really matters for the Pacific. You're dealing with tiny economies. So a change in total exports of 5% is a really big deal. Okay, so they really want to know what's going on with this, and I think that's an area where an agency like ADB can definitely intervene. So I think that's. Oh no, I've got one more. Let me just maybe conclude on this last point. So we've talked about the GBC points, and sort of my takeaway from this. If I was a policymaker in Asia, I would be saying, oh my God, not only do I have to worry about TPP and what's going to happen with that, not only do I have to worry about RCEP, not only do I have to worry about FCAP, I've now also got to think what's going on with Brexit and NAFTA. Okay, I've got to care about that. And the modelling that I've done is very simple. Okay, so this is the sort of stuff that any researcher with a data set and a computer can do. Governments can do much better to look at the industrial impacts, the sectoral impacts, the employment impacts, the price impacts, all this sort of thing. So I hope that Asian governments are doing that and are getting appropriately involved in the process. And again, you guys can tell me if that is actually going on or not. But otherwise, that's the presentation. Thanks very much for your